All right. Welcome, everyone, to our XRM virtual meeting. Second one in 2 weeks, so we kind of put them side by side here. But welcome to Authentication, how to get everything wrong, with our guest MVP, Marius Auger. Just as a reminder, we are recording today, and the recording's been started, so that's good. We'll post on our events page the recording, so if you need to drop off and want to catch up with what else was added, you can do that, and then share with others as well. Watch out for your tweet from XRM Virtual when that does get loaded. Sometimes we're kind of slow to respond to that. Sometimes it's up sooner than what we tweet, but yeah, we'll look for that to post as well. So we are always looking for speakers. So if there is something that you would be interested in talking on or speaking on, please give us a call or give us a contact information at xrmvirtual.com. If there's something you want to have a topic on but you don't want to present, we do that as well. So you can reach out to us at xrmvirtual.com or also julie.yak@xrmvirtual.com. The email is listed in the bottom of the slide deck. So, we have another virtual meeting scheduled for November 6th with Celine, Azure Functions Integration Scenarios with Dynamics 365. So that should be another great session. But without further ado, I'm going to give control over to Marius here. He is formerly known as the CRM Viking on Twitter and maybe elsewhere as well. But I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself and go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Daryl. So, welcome to my first XRM Virtual. I haven't even attended before, so this is going to be awesome, I hope.
You're a heathen. By the way, I forgot to mention, if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself, but you can also feel free to enter in the chat, and I'll try to butt in at an appropriate moment.
Yeah, so it says I'm viewing my notes here, but I'm really not, so yeah. Dynamics 365 authentication, how to get everything wrong. So let's just hope the presentation goes better than what I have tried and failed to do over the years. This is basically just a collection of my knowledge working with different integrations with Dynamics and figuring out how to get stuff working when the SDK is, of course, doing its job brilliantly. Which I have to say because Microsoft has made an excellent SDK for us. So, warning, explicit lyrics. I do hope I can contain my frustration, but we'll see. So, authentication. A lot of people think that this is just your username and password. So this is the level 100 part. So we have lots of different ways to authenticate. And for Dynamics, the most usual ones are VSFed and OAuth. So just to quickly go through my notes here. So cookie authentication is basically when you're using a web browser and you're authenticating and you're getting cookies that are stored in your browser, which lets you log in and do everything you want. The cookie is stateful. This means that both the server and client must know about the cookie for the session to work. Then we have token-based. So token, when you authenticate, a token is generated which you retrieve, and this can be stored in session storage, or it could be stored in a cookie as well, which it often is. But the thing about tokens is that it's stateless. So that means if you get your hand on a token, you can reuse it. So this works to your advantage in some scenarios where you can authenticate with the service that gives you a token, which you then can reuse for other services, even though you're not connected to the final authenticated endpoint, like Active Directory behind an ADFS server. And then we have ADFS. which is short for Active Directory Federation Services. It's a secure token service from Microsoft, and it's included in Windows servers. I think, if I remember correctly, ADFS version 2 and 3 are the ones supported with Dynamics. I think there's a bug in with ADFS version 4. Not really important. Infrastructure, who cares about that anyway? Right, Daryl?
Right.
Yeah. WS Fed, which is short for, I think, Windows Server Federation. It is a signing protocol which will give you a SAML token, keyword token here. So it's a SAML 1.1 token. Then we have SAML, which is also a sign-in protocol, but it's also a token type. So SAML authentication will give you a SAML 2.0 token. So yay, logic. OAuth, it's an open standard for access delegation, and it allows you to reuse authentication systems with other services. It started to gain some traction, and then they decided to, hey, let's create OAuth 2.0. So OAuth, I'm just going to jump around a bit, but OAuth 2.0 is an authentication framework, and it describes authorization flows. It does not explain how to implement them. So instead of being a protocol like OAuth 1 is, it's a loose framework which lets you implement it in a, as I've described here, a safe or a stupid manner as you wish. So even though it's called OAuth 1 or OAuth 1.0 and OAuth 2.0, they are not the same. Where OAuth says this is a car, it has airbags, and you can use it to travel on tarmac from A to B, OAuth 2 says you have to create a vehicle. It needs tires and a steering wheel, and it has to start from point A and end up at point B, however you like that to happen. OpenID is also an open standard, and it's a decentralized authentication system. It allows you to use whatever identity provider you like, and you can think of it like OAuth as the providing and an OpenID as the receiving end, which is an oversimplification. Most people have already used OpenID. It's typically when you sign up for a service and you can use your Google account or Twitter account or Microsoft account to access that service without creating, well, without explicitly creating a user account. And then we have JWT, which is a type of token, stands for JSON Web Token, which is becoming widely used. It's a hash token, and it is signed by a provider. That means that you can reuse this token in several places as long as the signature can be verified. So, as I said earlier, that means you can reuse the token by client and services that aren't actually connected to each other, as long as both systems can contact the identity provider for validation. I said that it was a hashed token. It's hashed JSON, actually, so you could include a lot of information in that token if you wanted to. So kind of like claims, you could include your primary SID, you could include email, you could include the favorite color if you had that for a user. In many cases, you can include too much information. So please do not be that guy. Don't have too much information. Okay, trying to speed up a bit. Okay. OAuth 2, it's being used almost everywhere, and I wish that was a good thing. What OAuth 2 means is that you're going to be using a grant flow, and you might know which type you're going to use, but you have no idea how it's going to be implemented. And I see developers struggle with this time and time again to find out how OAuth 2 works for one particular provider. So that's the biggest issue of it being a framework and not a defined protocol or whatever. So if you learn how to do OAuth2 with Google, you might not be able to do OAuth2 with Microsoft without additional knowledge. So if you're already logged into OAuth, then JWT tokens are awesome. It lets you sign in a valid tokens. You can include information, as I said, and I really like it because it makes authentication and providing information needed for your services a lot simpler. Talking about authentication, authentication is just a part of what we call security. So if you use OAuth2 with multi-factor authentication, and then you have a pretty safe system, but it doesn't mean that it is secure. So if you log in with those systems, someone can still steal your laptop or just sit down by your computer when you're not using it, and yeah, they are logged in. So it's important to remember that it's not secure even though you have high security. Everything is basically a password. Your fingerprint is a password. Your app password is a password. Your backup codes are password. A certificate is a password. Yeah, fingerprints, whichever thing you're using, it's basically just a password. It's being hashed by some system and stored as information. And I actually like actual passwords better because I find it hard to change my fingerprints. So I've said here that users are stupid, lazy, and demanding, and that is true and false at the same time. So a user might sign up for a password manager, use their Google account, then store their Google account inside the account, the password manager, and let the Google account be the primary recovery device for that password manager. So as long as they have either of the passwords, a hacker will have everything in your entire life. So I think that's a good example of how to do something stupid. And users aren't really lazy. It's more that they have lazy behavior patterns. So they will think that a password policy is stupid, so they use kitten01. And then you increase that number every time to kitten02, kitten03, or kitten September. I'm using kitten because it was International Cats Day the other day. But users often comply with really stupid requirements, like your password needs to be 12 characters, at least one lowercase, one uppercase, one digit, one special character, not part of your username, no two same after each other, etc., etc., etc. But even though they do stupid things, they have lazy behavior patterns, and they do accept insane standards, they are also demanding. So they would require that when I'm logged in, I don't have to type in my username and password anymore. So all the systems I'm using with this username and password, I should be automatically logged in. And that's where authentication starts to become troublesome. So, use cases. My users need to log in interactively. This is the most simple scenario. So if you're using a web app, this is where Active Directory authentication library is going to handle this for you beautifully. It just redirects you and makes sure that you do all the authentication steps, and finally returns a token which can be used for the services. It supports Azure multi-factor authentication, so that's great because multi-factor authentication is not, there is not a required way to implement that according to the OAuth2 standard, and Microsoft have implemented it differently than, for example, Google. So it's great to use this library so you don't have to think about how do I deal with the whole redirect thing and waiting for a multi-factor response. It basically works on anything which has a browser. and in some cases your users may have to accept that this application logs in on behalf of you or reads your information, etc. These can also, for Azure AD, these can be pre-approved so your users don't see them, which I also recommend that an administrator do, because it will reduce the amount of emails asking if this is a hacker or a malicious site or whatever. So this is how difficult it is to get tokens using Active Directory authentication library. So as you see, I've used this fantastic Dynamics URL. I'm not sure why I masked it, because you're going to see it in clear text in just a few minutes when I show you my code. It's a client ID and redirect URI, so this tells you that this is OAuth2. For those of you who wonder, this client ID and redirect URL might be the same ones used for the plugin registration tool, but that's just speculation from my part. Parameters, so it just basically the library has a function which does a request and collects the authentication parameters from the return headers from the 401 response. And then you just insert those along with whatever URL you're going for with the client ID and redirect URI, and you will get a prompt screen to log in. And voila, you have an access token ready to be used with all kinds of services. This will not work on Windows computers where you log in with a Microsoft account, and I'm talking like at outlook.com or live.com, hotmail.com, xbox.com, etc. And as you can see here, this is the result of the initial request. It says unauthorized, and then it returns the authorization URI and the resource ID in the headers. Okay, so you want to log in with your Google account. This is actually possible through third-party providers. So I'm just going to have a bit of water here. So the guys at Auth2 did an awesome article on how to set this up with their own solutions. So what you're doing here is that you need federated auth with Microsoft, which means there has to be an ADFS server somewhere. And by using Auth2, you can then log in with your Google account, and it will be translated into Microsoft credentials, and then you will get redirected into the service you're using. So that makes it possible for you to log into Dynamics 365 using your Google account. In the background, what happens is that a user account is created in Office 365, and Auth2 handles the translation part where you are logged into Google, and it translates that into something that is acknowledged by Office 365, which lets you get a valid token, etc. I recommend you read this article if that scenario sounds interesting to you. I'm not going to go through all of it because it's a lot. I spent a few hours setting that up, and I'm not going to spend the rest of this presentation talking about it. I want to say this is not the same as using a Google as a SAML IDP identity provider. SAML IDP basically means that you log in with Google somewhere, and then an account is created for you. In this scenario, there's an actual user account created with your Office 365 tenant, and Auth2 just translates the authentication for you. And you can't use Google as a SAML IDP for Dynamics 365, at least not that I know of. So I want to have guest accounts in my tenants. This is actually possible. So if you have Azure AD business to business set up, then you can have guest accounts and you can assign them licenses so they can use Dynamics even though they're not part of your organization. So this works great unless you want groups integration, because that won't work with a guest account. Unified Service Desk won't work with a guest account. And the app for Outlook won't work because server-side sync can't be enabled for guest accounts. So if this scenario is something you're into, then I think the Power Apps licensing scenario is the one you're looking for. And with the Power Apps licensing, you can actually use Flow to do some of the Outlook integrations. So
hold on a second here, Marius. So that previous slide is having other companies that have Microsoft accounts, and you're allowing them to access your CRM environment with that, and
yeah,
you're setting up a user for them in that environment then?
yeah, so if you have an account at contoso.com, you can be, and they set up a business-to-business integration with Acme or
Acme works, yep.
some fancy bicycle company. Then those users can be assigned Dynamics licenses, and you can access Dynamics cross-tenant.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So on to the good stuff. And I do not endorse drugs in any way. Just want to make sure that you all know that. So golden rule, use XRM tooling. XRM tooling will automatically support new APIs. It will automatically stop using the deprecated ones before they go away. The only thing required is to update your NuGet packages and you're good to go. So that's the golden rule. And if you like to follow Microsoft advice, then this whole presentation stops for you right here. However, if you have other needs or want to know how to do it any other way, application users, that's one way to set up application users in Dynamics instead of using an actual account. Don't use, okay, yeah, you'll have to explain that later. So application users are still users. They cannot be deleted inside Dynamics, just like a normal user. You can reassign them. So you can create a new application and reassign an application user, but you cannot delete it. It will be in there forever. If you can't use XRM tooling, then the Active Directory authentication library is the easiest way to get tokens. It is really easy to use, as we will see. If you use that along with a web client, you're good to go with the web API, actually. So if you use ADAL, then please don't inject your bearer tokens into the organization web proxy client. We are going to do exactly that in this presentation, but please don't do that. Just like it should be an edge case before you do that. Also, please don't use a COM browser element to retrieve authorized cookies, which can be injected into a custom cookie behavior class for your organization web proxy client. Like, just please don't do that. And let's hope nobody has done that and will present it later. Also, use Key Vault whenever possible. So Azure Key Vault is awesome, and you can store everything securely there. You can give access to someone who has like a key person in the company, instead of saying that a general administrator is going to generate a certificate which he has the password to. And then you can retrieve it safely using an application. It is, of course, not great for when you're doing a lot of requests in a short amount of time, because it will add overhead. So I can understand why you're still using hard-coded usernames and passwords, but I really don't like usernames and passwords.
So there's a question on that, Marius, the Key Vault. If you want to connect to a website that requires some sort of authentication from your CRM plugin, you can use that key vault to access that, correct? To access the password for that?
Yeah.
And then does that actually go down to the CRM plugin itself, or does that get handled behind the scenes in like a server-to-server sort of pass?
Okay, so can you repeat the question? I might have heard wrong here, but I think
All right.
so.
So my question on that, I had this week. Sorry to hijack this question, but
No.
if I want to connect to another site that requires a username and a password, and I'm doing it from my plugin,
Yeah.
that with the Azure Key Vault, that means that I get the username and password in my plugin in plain text that then I pass in through to the other provider then? Or is it somehow different than that? Like, what's preventing a developer from running the code on their machine and pretending to be CRM plugin and accessing the user ID and password, or the password?
Yeah. So if you give, first of all, plugins are sandboxed, so they aren't running in a user context. They are running kind of anonymously with awesome backdoor into the execution context. So if you're going to use Azure Key Vault, you would have to have some credentials to open it. So if a developer has those credentials, it doesn't matter if he's using a plugin or not, because an Azure Key Vault doesn't have what you call that. So you can set explicit permissions per entry in an Azure Key Vault. You either have access to read secrets or you don't have access to read secrets. So if your developer already has that, has those credentials, then yes, he will be able to get them through plugins, but he could also get it from any other application. And if you're going to use this in an execution context, I think, yeah, I would probably do secure config, and there is no point in adding Key Vault in addition to that. I just see that as additional overhead, actually.
Well, it allows somebody else to manage those, if they need to update them. That would be one advantage, I would think, if they're managing all their passwords in Key Vault versus some are here, some are there, some are over there.
Well, true. So I think it depends on your scenario. If it's just one plugin, then you're creating overheads, and
Yep.
how often does it trigger, etc. So
Okay.
Usually I just use webhooks, Azure Functions, Flow, etc. There's often you can find a different scenario to use out of the box functionality. So if you're going to do updates at a rate where you're allowed to add the overhead of accessing the Key Vault, I think you would find a scenario with Flow that fits that, usually.
Okay.
So it means we need to create always an app ID secret key. Can you expand on that question? I don't know if the other participants are allowed to chat here or.
Yeah, it should be able to unmute themselves if they need to.
Yeah. So, Izar?
Yes, I hear you. For when we use ADAL, we need always an application ID and secret key to connect to our dynamic CRM environment, or there is another way.
With application users, there's also certificates.
Okay.
So I have complete code for how to use certificate auth. I think I might have the Visual Studio window open, so we can definitely look at it after the presentation. I will send out the link. So it's a open GitHub project which explains how to generate certificates and how to do certificate authentication. So
okay, thank you.
If you're doing an integration where there's a lot of requests and it requires a lot of throughput, certificate will skip 1 or 2 round trips. Will actually be a tiny bit faster than using client ID and secret. Okay, so use XRM tooling. It supports all scenarios except client ID and secret. So as Matt Barber says, client ID and secret is just the username and password. So that shouldn't be a problem because you can use certificate auth. That would be true, except that if you deploy an application in Azure Web Services, then you can't add certificates to your application in a good manner. So you could add public certificates, but those aren't signed. As soon as you have a PFX with a private key, those aren't public and those can't be made available to your application. So you're stuck having to store the certificate along with your code or somewhere else to get the certificate, like the Azure Key Vault or whatever. And again, if you're doing a lot of throughput, then you don't want the overhead of the Key Vault, or you have to implement your own caching. So it would support all scenarios if we had a great way to get that certificate in an Azure web app. And in my case, I almost always host things in Azure web apps, so that's why I want to bring that point up. So the XRM tooling already uses both the web API and the WCF service according to the Lord. And this is a picture of our Lord and Savior, Matthew Barber. XRM tooling will be maintained forever. That means that, again, our Lord and Savior, Matt Barber, has said that this is the way to going forward. So it's going to work until he says otherwise. And he's usually good at telling us a long time ahead of, like the organization data service, he let us know that it was going to be deprecated, and it was deprecated, and it's been deprecated for 5 or 6 years, I believe. So XRM tooling is safe for the foreseeable future. XRM tooling does not work in .NET Core, and that's because it relies on the XRM SDK, and the XRM SDK relies heavily on the .NET framework for dependencies on like Windows Workflow Foundation and stuff like that, which isn't available in .NET Core. And it requires Active Directory Authentication Library version 2. So a change they made to recent versions is that they actually explicitly set their requirements to be version 2, not 3 or 4. So before you could install this XRM tooling and then you could upgrade your ADAL package to version 3, and then authentication would stop working and you would get some mythical error message, which I've seen too many times in my life. But now they finally set a requirement for maximum version, and it works brilliantly. So application users are just users. I just want to stress this point. Application users cannot be deleted. Azure AD app registrations can be deleted, so you can have an application user which is no longer accessible. They can be reassigned, luckily, so you can reassign them to new applications. And application users can log in, but not with XRM tooling. Well, that's not true. I'm lying here. Do not pay attention to the fourth point, because you can log in with a certificate, so don't mind me. So you cannot use XRM tooling for reasons. Then ADAL is the easiest way to get tokens, as said before. It supports the OAuth2 flows, it supports multi-factor authentication, it supports BSFED. Yeah, it supports all the login methods. There's a flavor for C#, of course, for Java, and there's also a JavaScript library for it. So you could, and I have, created a version which you can use for plugins, which does a OAuth2 authentication using only system libraries. It even does discovery and all the things you need to find the resources, authority, and to complete an entire code flow, and you don't need to know anything about the service beforehand. I did this in Visual Basic originally. Yeah. No, I'm not frustrated. Everything is nice. Yeah, so I also have that on GitHub. Can share the link afterwards. If you use that in your plugins, then you can do OAuth2 authentication with any Microsoft service. And it also supports ADFS. So yeah, that's great. So I've been talking a lot. It's been using most of my presentation time for this. So hopefully there are people in here who will appreciate that we're going to look at some code instead. So, share desktop, always scary. So can everyone see eternity now? I hope you do.
Sorry, I'm on mute. We can see you switching back and forth between your and see Visual Studio now. Yep.
Great. So this is the URL I so cleverly disguised earlier. It's my sandbox tenant. So we're going to look at how to do stuff you shouldn't do today. Welcome to this presentation. So the basis for all of this is my tenant URL. And we're going to look at how to do the different kinds of authentications. So I'm not going to run it now because that would be silly. So first part is how to get the CRM service client with the VS-Fed authentication. So let's hope I don't have any usernames and password anymore. Yep.
Mars, can you zoom in your code?
Oh, yeah, I can.
Much better.
Yeah, great. So I have this static method here, which just gets organization service. It says secure pass. It loads it from app settings, which you should absolutely not do, but everybody does it. So who am I to judge? Yeah, so new client gets the username and password from my config file. It says which region, and it says what my organization name is. Actually, I'm not sure why I even have this parameter here. It's not being used. So, oh, crud. How do I get? If I do Control-Shift-Space, it just opens up Skype here. So, yeah. One of these is require new instance, which means that it's not going to reuse an old instance. And I think this was true or false. True. Yeah. Organization detail, not including anything there, and use SSL. So that's basically everything that's being done. And that's all I need to authenticate, and hopefully this will work. Yeah. So the whoami result actually has results and values, and I bet this is really, really small for you. But for those who've used Dynamics before, you know that this will provide an error message if you're not authenticated. If you don't trust me, just ask Daryl. He knows what he's doing. So that's how easy it is just to use the XRM tooling. There's no doctorate in authentication going on here. You don't even need to do the things I'm doing necessarily. So next time it's going to be even better. Awesome. So that's VS-Fed authentication. that means that I get a SAML 1.1 token. It's not really usable outside of this scope because it's you need all the cookies and everything the next time you send a request. It's harder to deal with. Next up, we're going to look at how to use ADAL. So what I do here is that I take the base address and I append API data. And that's because the base dynamics address doesn't return a 401. It returns a 200 OK because it has an anonymous service, so it allows you to request it without getting an error message. Using the /API/data will produce a 401 message, which means we have something to work with. So here again, you can see a client ID and a redirect URL, which may or may not belong to the plugin registration tool. So just to talk a little bit about that. So OAuth2 uses a client ID and redirect URL to tell which application is being used. I don't know what the design principle behind this was, but it's whenever you publish an app which uses OAuth2, you have published something where somebody can get to your client ID and redirect URL. As an example, this is actually from the plugin registration tool. The plugin registration tool is an enterprise kind of app, so it's already pre-approved for all Dynamics organizations everywhere. If you use this, you won't get this app is requesting access on your behalf. It will just work. So it doesn't actually give any value having a client ID and redirect URL. It isn't more safe. It just doesn't help with anything, but the framework being what it is, you have to provide it. So I see them as a way to figure out if it's OAuth authentication or not. So as you saw earlier, create from resources URL async is just one of the included methods. So it will take the resource URL with the API data, and because I'm not doing things in a proper way with async and everything, I'm just getting the result from the return task. And parameters are the authority. I'm doing a new file cache here for authentication parameters. And here is the auth result, just as auth token, acquired token async, and parameters down here. So this is one of the breaking changes between version 2 and version 3, is that version 2 actually has a method which is acquire token, not async. So with lots of different overload methods. This one just disappeared for version 3, and it didn't come back for version 4 either. The acquire token async method, however, is available for, is available for everyone. Does anyone know how to get the suggestions without Control-Shift-Space?
Can you go to the definition of it? Just see the actual Control-J?
Yeah, but there's tons of them. So there's tons of the acquire token async.
Greg says Control-J, but...
Oh. No.
Do what you did before. Delete a comma and put it back in.
Right. So it has a lot of overload methods, and with version 3, this particular overload method only takes 3 parameters. No, 4 parameters. So it's just completely broken. Your code won't work upgrading to version 3. Who's to blame? Who am I to say? But I wish I knew who made this library so we could give them a real talking to, as we say over here. Anyway, enough about that. We have everything we need here. So well, don't need to break there. So doing this, the ADA library automatically figures out that, hey, you're not logged in. So here's a sign-in window. So I'm going to do just that. I'm not at that company right now. Yep. So here's my ADL token. And it's a long string, not going to show you that one completely because this is a token. That means it's reusable. So if any of you guys had malicious intent, you could take this token and act on my behalf in my tenant. And you already know the address to my tenant, so I'm not particularly interested in giving you a working token either. So now I have a token, and with that token, I can do awesome stuff. For example, like you shouldn't do, create a organization web proxy client. As you see here, we're using the old service endpoint /web for a web-based authentication. And this organization web proxy client has a property named header token, which is just a bearer token without the bearer keyword in front. So as you can see here, I have a CRM URL. I take a bearer token. There's nothing else magic going on here, just the URL false for using strongly typed. And it doesn't matter if you are true or false, strongly typed or not, this doesn't matter. Who cares about early bound anyway? Are you still there, Daryl?
Them there are fighting words, man.
Right, yeah. And then I set the bearer token. So if everything goes according to plan, then I should have a valid who am I result running this one. And I do. So again, I'm assuming this is really small, but the who am I results would, these requests would fail if I didn't have valid credentials. So this means I'm logged in and that I can do stuff. So it doesn't look particularly exciting doing just that, but as we're going to see here with the acquired token async, we have a lot of different options here. So you have client assertion. So you can use any kind of client assertion here, client credentials, client assertion certificate, and you have the prompt behavior. So you can say that you should always prompt, or you can say that you should never prompt. You should just fail silently if you don't have a valid token. Extra query parameters, haven't even used that myself, but yeah, you have a lot of different ways to do the acquired token async, and all of them give you an authentication result. And with the authentication result, you have a token that can be used inside an organization web proxy client, which again, you shouldn't do, but sometimes there's just no way around it. So I want to stress that this endpoint is deprecated and it's going to disappear in the future. I don't know when, but it is deprecated and that fact doesn't change. So if you do this, don't ever blame me. Well, you can blame me, but I won't listen to you. So now you have been warned. So, but that means with the get token, acquired token async, you can use a certificate or a client ID and secret, and with that you have a valid token which you can inject into this one. And the organization web proxy client is, like most other clients, inheriting from iOrganization service. So you're good to go for most of the things you normally do with your development. Also, this bearer token would of course work with the web API. So I could easily just do if I have the so I could do a new web client, and I could say that the client I could set the base address, download file, whatever, and just set the bearer token for this client and reuse the one we got earlier. So if you want to use the supported new endpoint, which isn't really new anymore, then this one would work as well. So over to the part which I'm most proud of, but I don't ever have to use anymore because it's just working really well with the ADA library and application users and so on. I want to show you how to do things in a very, very wrong way. So I'm just going to show you the results first. So as you can see, this is a Windows form. It just logged me in using Kerberos, and I have a valid who are my results here. So how did this happen? I obviously didn't use any credentials or anything. Well, I have copied some stuff from the SharePoint PNP crew and did a fun little cookie authentication scenario. So what I'm doing here is that I'm getting authenticated cookies with the server URL and an authentication type. So the authentication type is Office 365. So it just basically opens a COM browser, sets what the target URL is, and it starts browsing to Dynamics. It gets redirected to the login page. Then if you're not automatically logged in using Kerberos like I am, then you will type in a username and password, and as soon as all of the authentication is finished, you are then redirected to your Dynamics 365 URL. And that means that you hit the navigation end URL. As soon as you hit the end URL, the COM browser closes, but not before the cookies you have gotten are stored. So this does web authentication, which is VS-Fed. It stores your SAML 1.1 token, so it can be reused. And that isn't really helpful usually, but I've created a cookie behavior. As you can see here, it has some binding parameters. So here's where the magic happens. So there's cookie inspector, which just sets the cookie count to cookie count, and yes. So if this header is empty or non-existing, then it sets a header which is set cookie, and on the before send, it looks for the authorization header because this is automatically set in the organization web proxy client. So you have to remove the existing authorization header or this won't work at all. And then so this is really hard to see with this scaling, but I just inject the cookies that I have directly into the request. So then I have to, so it's this one, extension. So then I've created an extension for the organization web proxy client, which takes in a client, and for the client, which takes in a cookie collection. And it says that for each cookie in the cookie collection, add the cookie into the container. Then I instantiate a new cookie behavior with that cookie container, and I add the cookie behavior to the endpoint behaviors. And by doing all of this, I finally have an organization web proxy client which lets me authenticate using cookies from COM browser. So cookies you would get browsing to Dynamics with your Internet Explorer or Chrome, whatever. So this bypasses all of the other authentication types like OAuth and VSFed and etc. It just uses your browser, collects the cookies, and injects them right into the pre-compiled SDK. And it works, and it's fast, as you can see. And please don't ever do that. It's not supported at all because, as you might expect, this extension is not as supported. It's not supported to extend the organization web proxy client like this, especially when the cookie behavior removes headers from the organization web client. But hey, boys got to eat. No, I'm just rambling on here. So, yep. I just wanted to show that off because I'm quite proud of it.
So you're proud of it, but don't use it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Or use it knowing that it could die any day?
Well, I never said that. So what I want to show you as a last step, I'm just going to stop sharing because I have too many windows on my other desktops. I'm going to try and find the Visual Studio window with the certification auth. So just sharing my screen again. So here is another console project, which I obviously love a lot. And here is how you do certificate authentication. So in my app settings, I have a certificate thumbprint, I have a Dynamics URL, I have a client ID, and a redirect URL. What this does, it goes to my certificate store for the current user and personal certificates, opens it read-only, and then it locates the certificate with the thumbprint stored here. Then we have two different ways of doing this. So if you've got the certificate like I did here, then yep. So if you've got the certificate here, then we instantiate a new CRM service client. It uses the certificate as an input, and then this is required, and this is just something that has been overlooked in the SDK. But the certificate store name is a store name, and store name is an enum. And enums cannot be null. So you need to have any kind of value here. So I'm just doing a new store name. So any value will do because you have the actual certificate. Certificate thumbprint null, instance URL, using unique instance true, or detail not needed, client ID, redirect URL because it's OAuth2, and token cache path. So lately I've been favoring doing just adding a .dat. I'm not sure why, but I've read too many blog posts.
Marius,
So
we've reached the top of the hour. I just want to be cognizant of the time. Were you going to be able to, do you have a wrap-up point you wanted to do, or what were you hoping to do?
So basically, I just wanted to show the two different certificate authentication types. So really quickly, the other kind is new CRM service client. You see certificate is null. It says the certificate store name, so it implies that the context you're running in needs to have access to this certificate store, and the thumbprint. So it collects the certificate from the store and does everything for you. So there was a bug in .NET Framework 4.7 where this would break, but I think it's fixed now in 7.1. It might even have been patched in 7.0. The issue with this is that you need to have a PFX certificate. You have to have the private key. So you can't reuse this for an Azure Web Service because the certificate store doesn't allow you to use certificates with personal with private keys. So that's why I have tended to go for the organization web proxy client, which you shouldn't do. Yeah, so I spent all my time displaying all of this. I don't really have a good wrap-up point, except that over the years, I have found many ways to do it the wrong way. And finally, I would say that there are enough supported ways to do it right that you don't have to do all of the wrong things I've shown you. However, there are edge cases, and I'm working with two edge cases right now, actually, where you might have to do it another way than what's recommended. So that's why I wanted to show you those other ways. All of the code and the presentation will be made public. I was hoping to write kind of a wiki article and just provide you with all the different ways to authenticate with.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah.
So how else can they contact you when they are trying to find this information? CRM Viking? Is that the best way to
so
talk
at CRM Viking on Twitter, or you can look for my name on the Microsoft Dynamics CRM group on Facebook, the one led by Menno Tekapula. And those are the simplest ways to find me.
Okay.
I love Twitter notifications, so just, send me anything.
All right. So someone make a bot to send Marius random tips of the day, just for fun. On his Twitter account. You'd appreciate that.
Yeah, do that. Just random words.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop